War? War never changes. On October 23, 2077, the storm of World War came once again, and in a brief few hours, the Earth was reduced to cinders through a blaze of atomic fire. In the years, decades, and centuries after the cataclysmic Great War, humanity would emerge from the ashes and struggle to rebuild itself in the post-nuclear wastelands of the ruined world, establishing new tribes, villages, and eventually political factions and states. But even after the apocalypse, humanity continues to endure a never-ending struggle for survival in the wastes, a struggle without end. Welcome to our new series on the lore of the Fallout universe. In this first episode, we will discuss the end of the old world, charting the course of the global war that plunged humanity into oblivion. The world of Fallout takes place in a separate timeline from our own, a timeline which maintained the same course of history and events as ours all the way up until the conclusion of World War II in 1945. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, the first use of atomic weapons against an enemy state in warfare, marked the split-off point for the Fallout universe's timeline, known as the Divergence. From 1945 onwards, the world of Fallout would advance on a different path, with this new Divergence timeline possessing its own unique developments in technology, culture, society, warfare, and politics that make it distinct from our own world. In the diverging Fallout timeline, the 20th century's Cold War continued in a manner somewhat similar to our own, albeit with several key differences. While the Cold War was still a struggle between Western capitalism and Eastern Bloc communism, the Soviet Union in the Fallout universe never collapsed in 1991, and by the 21st century, relations had warmed between the United States and the USSR, with both mutually maintaining a neutral or even amicable relationship towards one another. Instead, the Soviet Union's influence over Eastern Bloc communist countries began to wane in the 21st century, replaced by the growing power of the People's Republic of China. In this timeline, China never undertook the capitalist economic reforms of Deng Xiaoping like in our universe, and so even in the 21st century, the China of Fallout maintained a strict communist government, economy, and society, overtaking the Soviet Union as the United States' primary foe and Red Menace in the Cold War. In Fallout's timeline, the United States consolidated its 50 states into 13 Commonwealths in 1969, with the US flag redesigned to reflect this change. These 13 Commonwealths, grouping several states together, and in the case of California splitting it in two, would serve as a sort of mid-level administration between the state and federal governments. Also in Fallout's timeline, the nations of Europe banded together into a single unified state, the European Commonwealth. Unlike our own world's European Union, which is more of an economic, monetary and trade union, the European Commonwealth is a grand political entity combining all the nations of Europe into one sovereign government. Of course, the most obvious distinction of Fallout's Divergence timeline is its society and technology. Although the lore and backstory are rather ambiguous on its role in the Divergence, in the Fallout universe, the invention of the transistor, introduced to our world in 1947, was never popularized or widespread, with the vacuum tube continuing to serve as the main component of electronics and robotics in the 21st century. Because of this, as well as other factors such as lower priority on the militarization of computers and electronics, and a larger emphasis on utilizing bulkier, resource-demanding technologies, the Fallout universe became trapped in a 1950s-esque retro future. In this timeline, humanity harnessed the power of the atom not just for war, but for the advancement of society. They built energy-costly nuclear reactors and power plants to fuel the growing technological advancements of the world. Society, culture, and technology in Fallout all reflect this unique 1950s-style atomic age environment. Technologies once advertised in the past as pure science fiction were now a reality thanks to atomic energy, fusion-powered cars, sophisticated domestic robots, portable wrist-worn computers, medical breakthroughs, and of course advanced weaponry. The atom, originally thought to be the instrument of mankind's demise, had instead been used as a source for good, transforming the world and bringing about a brighter future. By the first decades of the 21st century, the Cold War seemed to be nearing its end. The threat of war seemed to be a thing of the past. Breakthroughs in science, medicine, and technology introduced a new age of peace and prosperity for all. it seemed as though nothing could stop humanity's progress. But war never changes, and by mid-century, the bill finally came due. By the year 2050, the world's access to natural resources, especially petroleum and uranium, an absolute necessity for the energy-demanding technologies of this timeline, had begun to run out. Decades of consumption had led to a critical shortage of the planet's available resources. Without access to petroleum and uranium, reactors began closing as gas prices skyrocketed and markets everywhere began to suffer from the effects. Seeing the growing resource shortage as a threat to its position as a world superpower, the United States government began an aggressive foreign policy campaign to assert its dominance over global markets and protect the interests of big domestic businesses, such as the mega corporation Poseidon Energy, which held influence over politicians in Washington. In 2051, the US imposed economic sanctions on Mexico to protect American oil and business interests, claiming that the climate of political instability within Mexico rendered their sanctions a necessity. Later that year, the United States military invaded Mexico, occupying the country to ensure the continued steady flow of oil northwards. Even with these steps, however, resource shortages continued to spike. The following year, a television documentary premiered in the United States showing the dried-up husks of Texas oil fields, alerting the common American people to the severity of the energy crisis. Protests over gas and energy prices erupted all throughout the United States, with some cases turning into riots breaking out for control over the country's remaining operational power plants. From here, things would only go from bad to worse. In April 2052, the European Commonwealth declared war on the countries of the Middle East in order to acquire their remaining stocks of oil. This marked the start of hostilities in the resource wars that would engulf the planet for the next 2.5 decades. Unable to bring about a peaceful resolution to the European Middle Eastern War, the United Nations collapsed as member states withdrew in droves, and the organization finally disbanded on July 26, 2052. The European Middle Eastern War continued for another 2 years, straining the resources and manpower of both sides to their limits. In December of 2053, a nuclear weapon was detonated in Tel Aviv, destroying the city, and in response, the European Commonwealth conducted a limited nuclear exchange with the Middle East in January of the following year. By the end of the war in 2054, both sides had exhausted their militaries and resources to the breaking point. The Middle East had depleted all of its remaining oil reserves for the war effort, and the European Commonwealth, now deprived of its much-needed oil and uranium, disintegrated into various quarreling, bickering nation-states, each warring for control over the last remaining resources on Earth. All the while, tensions between the United States and China continued to escalate in the 2050s and early 2060s. After the introduction of a deadly viral pathogen known as the New Plague in 2053 devastated the world population, killing tens of thousands, the American and Chinese governments began looking towards each other with increased hostility, as both desired to maintain their status as global superpowers on a geopolitical stage ravaged by conflict. With China heavily dependent on fossil fuels, its markets were suffering a sharp decline from the resource shortages. The Chinese government began searching for ways to gain access to oil and to take it by force if necessary. They saw a lucrative opportunity in acquiring more resources from the still operational Trans-Alaska Pipeline of Anchorage, Alaska. They asked the Americans for permission to drill in Anchorage, but the US government by the 2060s had cut off all talks of exporting their oil supply, retaining all remaining domestic resource reserves for themselves. In December 2066, the Chinese People's Liberation Army, led by General Wang Jingwei, invaded Anchorage to seize its oil fields, marking the start of the Anchorage Campaign and the Sino-American War. American military forces mobilized under General Constantine Chase on the Anchorage front line, a series of defensive lines which had been built up since 2059 for just such an attack. But they soon began straining under the weight of the assault from General Jingwei's Chinese army. For 10 years, battles and actions raged across the snowy Alaskan landscape. General Chase eventually managed to level the playing field in the Anchorage campaign with the introduction of the first units of specialized heavy infantry, utilizing newly developed T-45D power armor. These power-armored infantry units proved effective in withstanding Chinese tanks and artillery, and their vigorous attacks managed to gain back some lost ground. Soon, the Anchorage campaign devolved into a stalemate of trench warfare. as both Chase and Jingwei entrenched their armies in the brutal winter weather. The Americans faced a significant logistical obstacle in reinforcing the Anchorage front in the form of Canada, but under pressure from the United States, the Canadian government finally and reluctantly permitted American military forces to access their lands. But to the Canadians, the American presence in their country seemed like an occupation. The US government exploited Canada's remaining resources for their war against China, destroying much of the expansive timberland of the Canadian interior and confiscating their oil reserves. Canadian protests were ignored as the US treated their northern neighbours as Little America. Canadian protests soon turned into open riots against US troops, and before long, American forces began a military occupation of the country, facing a Canadian insurrection in various occupied cities. The American military occupation would eventually pave the way for Canada's complete annexation by the United States in 2076. With the Anchorage front stabilizing into trench warfare, a turning point in the war was reached in 2074, when the US military began undertaking offensive operations against mainland China itself. US Army infantry and mechanized divisions, together with Marines, sailors and airmen, were now fighting on 3 fronts, in Alaska, Canada and China. Major offensive campaigns were undertaken in China along the Yangtze River and the Gobi Desert, but it proved difficult for the Americans to establish good logistical supply lines. The Gobi and Yangtze campaigns would incur high casualties on both sides, and a state of stalemate was reached in the Sino-American War by 2075. Neither side was willing to back down, and as the casualties mounted, both nations worked on developing new technologies and experimental weapons to counter the enemy. In the United States, fears of espionage against their weapons development programs led to the US government ordering the forced relocation of all Chinese American citizens to internment camps. By 2076, the Sino-American War had turned a decade old, and neither side seemed close to winning. The Anchorage campaign and the offensives in China had ground to a complete stalemate. The situation in Alaska looked especially bleak for the battle-weary soldiers there. This would all change, however, with the US Army's introduction of a new experimental model of advanced state-of-the-art power armor, the T-51B. Power-armored infantry units equipped with the T-51B tipped the balance of the Anchorage campaign in America's favor, and before long, Chinese forces were in full retreat. Their supply lines broke down, and Chinese troops desperately tried to rally against the onslaught of American power-armored infantry units. On January 10, 2077, the Anchorage campaign ended in a complete American victory, with Jingwei's army forced out of Alaska entirely. Jingwei himself was killed in action, while General Chase declared complete victory. However, despite victory in Alaska, the war's outcome still seemed uncertain in 2077. Canadian resistance to American military occupation was increasing. Food and energy riots were breaking out in the domestic United States, and American forces in mainland China were still nowhere close to forcing the Chinese to sue for peace. As American troops continued pressing deeper into China, the resistance from the Chinese only intensified and incurred greater casualties for both armies. Billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of lives had been spent, and even after a decade of war, the Chinese had millions of able-bodied troops to call upon. It seemed for both the United States and China that the only way to settle the conflict would be through a nuclear strike. With nuclear war appearing imminent by the summer of 2077, the President of the United States and the federal government's leadership, as well as big business executives and other important figures in American high society, began relocating to an offshore oil rig in the Pacific, beyond the California coast. With China backed against the wall, their leaders came to the decision they long dreaded to contemplate. They felt the time had come to fire their nuclear weapons. On October 23, 2077, the Sino-American War would escalate into a world war and bring about the destruction of civilization. In our next video on the Fallout universe, the world will barrel ever closer to nuclear Armageddon. To ensure you don't miss it, make sure you have subscribed and press the bell button. Please consider liking and sharing as it helps immensely, and don't forget to comment. We'll try to read and respond to every comment, as we want to know what you think about this video and which videos you hope to see in the future. This is the Wizards and Warriors channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.